February 1, 1944. 30,000 feet above Nazi-occupied France. The temperature outside is -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cramped cockpit of a B-17 Flying Fortress, 23-year-old First Lieutenant Charlie Brown is bleeding from his face, struggling to stay conscious, and watching in horror as German fighters tear his squadron apart. His bomber, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, is shredded. 2 engines are dead. The tail section looks like Swiss cheese. Half his crew is wounded or dead. The oxygen system has failed, and they're 300 miles deep into enemy territory with no fighter escort. But what happens in the next 30 minutes will defy everything military strategists thought they knew about aerial combat. Because the pilot who's about to make the most insane decision of World War II isn't Charlie Brown. To understand just how crazy what's about to happen really is, we need to go back to the morning of January 1, 1944. The target, Bremen, Germany. One of the most heavily defended industrial cities in Hitler's Third Reich. The mission: destroy the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory that's churning out FW-190 fighters. The same fighters that are shooting down Allied bombers at an alarming rate. Charlie Brown and his crew are flying their first mission together. They're green, inexperienced, and they've been assigned one of the most dangerous bombing runs of the war. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be invincible. It had 1350 caliber machine guns. It could take tremendous punishment and keep flying. The Army Air Forces called it a flying fortress for a reason. But here's what they didn't tell the crews in their propaganda films. The average life expectancy of a B-17 crew member was just 11 missions. You needed to complete 25 missions to go home. The odds of surviving? About 25%. Charlie Brown knew the statistics. Every airman did, but like most 23-year-olds who think they're invincible, he figured it would happen to the other guy. That morning, as Brown and his crew of 9 men climbed into Ye Old Pub, the weather was terrible. Thick clouds, ice forming on the wings. The kind of conditions that made formation flying, essential for survival, nearly impossible. But the mission was a go. 379 B-17s took off that morning, heading deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. Only 346 would make it back. The first sign of trouble came before they even reached the target. Ye Old Pub's formation was struggling to stay together in the dense cloud cover. Then, without warning, they flew directly into the contrails of the bomber group ahead of them, a wall of frozen exhaust that cut visibility to zero. Brown had a split-second decision to make: pull up into potentially deadly clear skies where German fighters waited, or push through and risk a mid-air collision with a 65,000-pound bomber traveling at 180 miles per hour. He chose to push through. They made it, barely. Then came the flak. If you've never seen anti-aircraft fire at 30,000 feet, imagine this. Thousands of explosive shells detonating around you, each one sending superheated metal fragments in every direction at speeds that can penetrate armor. The sky turns black, the concussions rock your aircraft, and there's absolutely nothing you can do except fly straight and level toward your target. Ye Old Pub shuddered as flak fragments tore through its thin aluminum skin. One piece ripped through the nose, missing the bombardier's head by inches. Another punched through the fuselage, narrowly missing the oxygen tanks, which would have turned the bomber into a fireball. But they held course. They dropped their bombs, and then they turned for home. That's when the real nightmare began. The German fighters had been waiting for this moment. The moment when the bombers, having dropped their payloads, would be at their most vulnerable. When they'd be separated from their formation. When they'd be slow, heavy, and desperate to get home. 15 FW-190s and Bf-109s dove out of the sun. The first attack was devastating. A 20 mm cannon shell exploded in Ye Old Pub's nose, shredding the plexiglass and destroying the navigation equipment. The bombardier was hit. Blood splattered across the instrument panel. The second attack was worse. A fighter came in from 6 o'clock directly behind them, and walked a line of cannon fire from tail to nose. The tail gunner was killed instantly. The waist gunner took fragments in his leg. The top turret gunner was hit in the shoulder. Engine number 2 was hit and began trailing smoke. Then engine number 4 was destroyed completely, its propeller windmilling uselessly. The hydraulic system failed. The electrical system was damaged. The oxygen system was gone. And Charlie Brown? He took a piece of plexiglass to the face when a shell exploded in the cockpit. Blood poured from the wound, freezing in the -40-degree air rushing through the shattered nose. By all logic, by every rule of aerial combat, Ye Old Pub should have fallen from the sky. But somehow, impossibly, it kept flying. Here's what most people don't understand about flying a crippled bomber at 30,000 feet. Without oxygen, you have about 30 seconds before you pass out. Your brain stops working correctly. You make irrational decisions. You hallucinate, and then you die. Charlie Brown was flying on pure instinct and stubbornness. The situation inside Ye Old Pub was apocalyptic. The temperature was 60 degrees below zero. Wind screamed through dozens of holes in the fuselage. Spent shell casings littered the floor, mixed with blood and hydraulic fluid. The smell of cordite and burning oil filled the air. The bombardier was in shock from his wounds. The navigator was unconscious. The tail gunner was dead in his shattered turret. And the rest of the crew was fighting to stay conscious as the aircraft dropped altitude, desperately trying to get low enough to breathe. Brown pushed the control yoke forward, diving toward breathable air. The altimeter unwound, 25,000 feet, 20,000, 15,000, but diving meant speed, and speed with damaged control surfaces meant the aircraft could literally tear itself apart. The airframe groaned and shrieked under forces it was never designed to withstand. Rivets popped, metal buckled. One of the crew members later said it sounded like the airplane was screaming. At 10,000 feet, Brown finally leveled off. The crew could breathe again. But now they faced a different problem. They were flying at 200 miles per hour in a straight line over enemy territory, with no fighter escort, no way to defend themselves, and a smoke trail visible for 50 miles marking their position like a giant neon sign saying, "Easy target here." 15 miles away, at a Luftwaffe fighter base near Oldenburg, Germany, a 27-year-old ace pilot named Franz Stigler was just landing after shooting down 2 B-17s that morning. Franz Stigler was not a Nazi. He was a fighter pilot. A damn good one. He had 22 confirmed kills. He wore the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honor. One more kill would earn him the even more prestigious Oak Leaves. But Stigler was also a man shaped by a specific code of honor. His mentor, a legendary ace named Gustav Rodel, had told him something that Stigler never forgot. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you down myself. The principle was simple. You don't kill a defenseless enemy. It's not war, it's murder. When Stigler's ground crew saw the smoking B-17 limping across the sky, they pointed it out. Easy kill. His 23rd victory. Maybe the oak leaves. Stigler jumped back into his Bf-109 and took off. He was about to make the craziest decision of his life. Stigler caught up with the crippled B-17 in less than 3 minutes. He came up from below and behind the classic kill position. His thumb hovered over the firing button. One burst from his 20mm cannons and 30mm nose cannon would shred what was left of the bomber. But then he looked closer. The tail gunner's position was destroyed. The guns hung limp and useless. Through the holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see crew members slumped over, wounded or dead. The tail section was barely attached to the aircraft. One engine was completely gone. Another was trailing smoke and oil. And then Stigler saw something that changed everything. Through the shattered waist gun position, he made eye contact with one of the American gunners. A young man, maybe 20 years old, covered in blood, staring back at him with a mixture of terror and resignation. In that moment, Franz Stigler had a choice. He could follow orders. He could shoot down a defenseless bomber full of wounded and dying men. He could get his 23rd kill, his oak leaves, maybe even the swords. He could be celebrated as a hero of the Reich. Or he could remember what Gustav Rodel had taught him. You don't shoot a man in a parachute. Stigler made his decision. He pulled up alongside the B-17's left wing. Inside Ye Old Pub, the crew couldn't believe what they were seeing. Charlie Brown, still bleeding from his face wound, looked out his side window and saw a German Bf-109 flying in formation with him. Not attacking, not firing, just flying alongside. The German pilot was gesturing, pointing, trying to communicate something. Brown's first thought was that the German was directing flak batteries on the ground. They were about to be blown out of the sky. But then he realized, the German was pointing north. Toward the North Sea, toward England, toward home. Franz Stigler was doing something absolutely insane. Something that could get him court-martialed and executed. Something that violated every principle of military doctrine. He was escorting an enemy bomber to safety. Stigler flew alongside Ye Old Pub, waving off German flak batteries that tried to engage. When ground gunners raised their weapons, Stigler rocked his wings, a signal that meant, friendly aircraft, don't shoot. He stayed with the crippled bomber as it limped across enemy territory. When other German fighters approached, Stigler positioned himself between them and the B-17, making it clear that anyone who wanted to attack the bomber would have to go through him first. For 30 minutes, a German fighter pilot and an American bomber crew flew together over Nazi-occupied Europe. Natural enemies, sworn to kill each other, flying side by side like wingmen. When they reached the North Sea, the edge of German-controlled territory, Stigler flew close one last time. He made eye contact with Charlie Brown. He saluted, and then he broke off and disappeared into the clouds. Charlie Brown and his crew stared in disbelief as the German fighter vanished. They were alive. Against all odds, all logic, all probability, they were alive. When Ye Old Pub landed at its base in England, the ground crew couldn't believe the aircraft was still flying. One mechanic counted over 400 bullet and shrapnel holes. The tail section was held on by one main spar and prayer. One engine was completely destroyed. Another was barely functional. The hydraulics, electrical system, oxygen system, and most of the defensive armament were gone. An engineering officer told Charlie Brown that, by every calculation, the aircraft should have broken apart in midair. It was, in his words, a flying miracle. But when Brown tried to tell the intelligence officers about the German pilot who escorted them to safety, he was met with disbelief and suspicion. The debriefing officer told Brown in no uncertain terms, "Never speak of this again." If word got out that a German pilot had shown mercy, it could be seen as propaganda. It could undermine the war effort. And it might encourage other pilots to make dangerous assumptions about enemy behavior. So Charlie Brown stayed silent. For 40 years. Meanwhile, in Germany, Franz Stigler also said nothing. If his superiors had discovered what he'd done, he would have faced a firing squad. Aiding the enemy during wartime was treason, punishable by death. After the war, Stigler emigrated to Canada and became a successful businessman. He never told anyone about the incident. Not his wife. Not his children. No one. For 4 decades, 2 men on opposite sides of the world carried the same secret. 2 men who had shared 30 minutes of impossible humanity in the middle of the most brutal war in human history. And then, in 1986, something extraordinary happened. Charlie Brown, now in his 60s and recently retired, decided he needed to find the German pilot who saved his life. He placed an ad in a newsletter for German fighter pilots, seeking German pilot who escorted damaged B-17 to safety over North Sea, January 1944. Pilot flew Bf-109 with yellow nose, saluted before breaking off. "If you are that pilot, please contact me." 4 months passed. Brown received dozens of responses, but none matched the details of his encounter. And then, one day, a letter arrived from Vancouver, Canada. Franz Stigler had seen the ad. After 42 years of silence, he decided to break it. In his letter, Stigler described details that only the German pilot could have known: the condition of the bomber's tail section, the position of the dead tail gunner, the specific way he had saluted before breaking off. It was him. When Brown called Stigler, the 2 men talked for hours. They discovered they lived less than 200 miles apart. They arranged to meet. The reunion was emotional. 2 elderly men, former enemies, embracing like brothers. Because that's what they were, in a way. Brothers forged by an act of impossible mercy in the middle of hell. For the next 22 years, until both men passed away in 2008, Franz in March, Charlie in November, they were inseparable. They attended airshows together. They spoke at schools and veterans events. They became the best of friends. They called themselves brothers in war and friends in peace. So why does this story matter? In 1944, Franz Stigler's decision to spare Charlie Brown and his crew seemed crazy. Insane, even. It violated military doctrine. It put his own life at risk. It went against everything his training and his nation demanded of him. But here's what happened because of that one crazy decision. Charlie Brown lived to age 87. He raised a family. He inspired thousands with his story. His crew members, the ones who survived, went home. They had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, Conservative estimates suggest that Franz Stigler's decision to show mercy to one wounded bomber crew resulted in more than 200 descendants who exist today because he chose not to pull the trigger. 200 lives, 200 futures, hundreds of contributions to humanity, art, science, and society. All because one pilot made a crazy choice to see his enemy as human. Franz Stigler once said in an interview, "I didn't think about it as sparing an enemy. I saw 9 men who had already been defeated. They were out of the fight. To shoot them down would have been murder, not war. In a world that often seems determined to divide us, to make us see each other as enemies, as threats, as less than human. This story reminds us of something essential. The craziest thing we can do, the most radical, revolutionary, dangerous thing is to choose mercy when vengeance is expected. To choose humanity when hatred is easier. To choose to see the person in the uniform, the human behind the enemy." Franz Stigler's crazy move didn't just save 200 lives. It saved something else. Something we desperately need in our world today. It saved the belief that even in our darkest moments, even in the middle of war and hatred and violence, we can still choose to be human. In memory of Charlie Brown, 1922 to 2008, and Franz Stigler, 1915 to 2008. Brothers in war, friends in peace.